about the importance of economic clarity in nonprofit strategy. And I know it may not be the most exciting and glamorous of topics, but it is really, really important. And I hope tonight, through the discussion we have, you'll see how important it is. I don't think that this crowd is going to resist sort of the importance of economics based on our common shared history. But it isn't always the most exciting part of some of the consulting you might do in ACT. That being said, in our experience, it is integral to every case that we work on. It becomes a very important part of the framing of the decisions that we work with nonprofit leaders to make. And we take it very, very seriously. And it's not the same as accounting in for-profits. And cost analysis, or what we're going to discuss tonight, what we call service line contribution analysis, has differences, important differences from the type of analysis you might be accustomed to in your for-profit jobs. It has a lot of differences compared to what nonprofit leaders are accustomed to in the accounting that they often see from their finance groups. So it's nuanced, it's different from for-profit accounting, and it's definitely different for many of the EDs or presidents or boards of nonprofits that you'll be working with in your consulting projects. But I brought along the basics of how you do what we'll call a service line contribution analysis, and we brought it in paper form so that you could bring it along and use it as a sort of a little bit of an instruction manual if you get to the place in a volunteer project where you want to do one of these analyses. Equally important, and the topic of this second session, is clarity about costs. Really understanding what it costs to deliver the various programs and services of a nonprofit. And we call that at Bridgespan a service line contribution analysis. Nonprofits have different activities that we call service lines. Some people call them programs. You can call them what you want. But the various sets of activities, we call them service lines because we group them by virtue of services that are being provided to a set of beneficiaries. Okay? We think of it in terms of the activities that are leading to impact, the impact being for a set of people that the nonprofit is serving. So it's the set of services they provide, logically grouped, and then understanding the full costs of getting to those services. This is cost accounting in its basic form. It's just a little more complicated at nonprofits because of the differences in the way they raise money and the differences in the way they account for the money that they have on hand and how they spend it. So what you're basically doing in a service line contribution analysis is untangling their accounting so that you can get a clear sense of the fully loaded cost to deliver a type of service and matching that with the revenue they raise in order to provide that service to see what the net contribution is of a particular service within a nonprofit organization. Most often, a nonprofit does have, I shouldn't say most often, the presumption is that you have to invest in programs, that they're not going to be a net positive contributor financially to an organization, but that's not always true. And what's important to know is how much is being invested. So the fact that you've got greater or lesser negative is an important bit of data as you think about whether a program's having the impact that you want it to have. And we'll get to that. But being able to say, how much impact am I getting versus how much investment I'm making is the crux of the trade-off that nonprofit leaders need to make. But you need to be clear about both things. What is it I believe about impact, how it happens, so I can figure out whether a program is well aligned on that dimension, and how much is it costing me to get there? What's the negative or positive financial contribution the program is making to the nonprofit? So let's just start with a bit of overview. As I said, SLC analysis helps nonprofits make better decisions by determining full costs and corresponding revenues. It differs because their traditional accounting systems don't capture all of their costs. And what that makes nonprofit leaders think is typically that their programs are less expensive than they really are. Almost invariably, we do this analysis and a nonprofit leader goes, I didn't know it cost me that much to feed that person or to house that homeless person or to provide that class or to do that bit of policy work. It's based on a cost accounting concept that you might know as product line profitability, for those who might have engaged in that. And it's something that you can use to help your clients make some strategic decisions and also to assess their performance. One of the nice things we do with nonprofits sometimes is try to understand the cost per outcome. So once you get to that level of knowing the full cost of delivering a service, then you can do the division and say, how much did it cost to keep somebody off the street for a year, if that's your outcome that you're trying to accomplish? How much did it cost to train somebody so that they were ready to go to college? And you can begin to understand the full cost of delivering the impact that an organization is trying to get. Just a comparison to how an SLC analysis differs from typical accounting. Typically, costs are grouped in a nonprofit accounting system by function. They'll have their admin costs, their marketing costs, et cetera. In an SLC analysis, you unwind those and regroup them by service or by program, something that would be job training program or a housing program. And the idea there is that costs should be grouped based on the benefits they're providing rather than the organizational units. The kind of costs that are typically assigned in typical accounting systems are the direct costs, direct labor and direct materials. If you ask somebody in their program, how much does it cost to do your housing program? They'll know what the house costs, and they'll know what the labor of the people in the house cost, but they'll have no idea what the indirect costs are that are associated with it. And then the next step of understanding what portion of overhead is actually appropriately assigned to that is even further from the data that they've got. The financial measure in a typical accounting system is some sort of gross contribution measure, which just looks at direct costs relative to revenues. In an SLC analysis, it's a net contribution that looks at program revenues relative to full loaded program costs. Direct costs, common cost, and overhead costs. And we'll go through some of what that terminology means. So why would you want to do this? You find yourself on your next case with an ACT client. You're meeting with the ED, and issues are coming out, percolating out of the conversation that you're having with them. And when should you be on the lookout and say, we may want to do one of these analyses. We may want to dive deeper into their economics. A typical example of that for us is when a nonprofit leader comes to us and says, as they did actually in this case we're going to discuss, we're thinking about going to a new place. We think our program's great. We're thinking about taking it to a new geography. Or they're saying, we really like our program X. We want to expand it. Or they say, we're out of money and we need to cut something and we don't know what to cut. Another is, and oftentimes they don't even know they need this, but they're raising money and they're talking to their funders about the cost of their activities and raising money for it, and they don't understand the cost of their activities. So the numbers they're putting forward oftentimes don't capture the full cost and they raise too little. So part of it's getting clarity around how much money to ask for. More and more we see nonprofits that are attempting to earn income, that have businesses or they charge a fee for service, or there's some portion of their activity where they actually get money in exchange for what they're doing that's not just a grant or a gift, that looks a little bit more like a business stream. You'd be surprised how often when you dig down deeper and do this analysis, earned revenue is not often equivalent with earned income. That when you do the analysis fully and you say, what does it cost to deliver that service, oftentimes people have priced too low. And they're losing money on every increment of what they think is an income-generating activity. Sometimes that's okay if they understand it and they're willing to make that investment or that subsidy because of some impact they're getting for it. But oftentimes, nonprofit leaders take on earned revenue activities because they want to make money to pay for something else. And it's not on mission, or it's not something that's delivering impact. And then they've got the worst of both worlds, where they're actually engaged in something that is both diverting them from their mission and costing money. And without that sort of analysis, they often don't know. And then, the fundamental question is how to allocate resources. And once you understand what it really costs to get something done, you can make a clear decision that we believe it's best for us to take our people or our money and put it against activity X versus activity Y, because we believe that the investment is going to yield sufficient impact return for doing it. So I just wanted to pause there and ask, because I bet this isn't, in some of your cases, too far afield from things you've done before. So how many folks who've worked on an ACT case have done something that they think looks like this? Leslie? Somebody describe what you ran into, how hard it was, what you used it for, what the situation was.
One was for Film Arts Foundation in San Francisco. It was a straight cost accounting. They wanted to know what their services cost. So we went through their array of services, which include seminars and rentals of equipment and some advocacy work, and we just did a straight accounting. Then the one I just worked on was for Women's Initiative for Self-Employment, and they had activity that they thought they could sort of possibly parcel out as a cash cow. But it turned out that that would have been a real money hole, so that was a big no. And that was definitely one of these categories.
So was it hard to get the data?
Not for the first case, and yes for the second.
Do you feel like you did it right?
Yeah, I think so. I think we got close enough.
Yeah. There is an 80-20 component to this too, of doing enough analysis to get at the decision. that you need to get to. And then there's a follow-on part of this that we find in our client work oftentimes, which is you end up redoing everyone's accounting system. And once you've done this once, people need or want to continue to have this level of insight into their economics. And so we build in, when we do this, a presumption that we're redoing an accounting system that'll end up with a financial management report that these folks will get. So we want to train the accountants along the way. We want to build the system so it's not just our spreadsheet, but it's their spreadsheet. We have a training component so that they actually can use it afterwards. We sometimes format a report so that they can actually get something that they'll want to use again. So we don't oftentimes do this as a one-shot analysis, but more like a redo of their financial systems. The process of getting this done really takes has 4 steps. The first is just defining the terms of analysis. What are the service lines? What is it you're trying to get accomplished? The second is doing the actual allocation of the costs. Put these down. The third is matching revenue to those costs so you understand the net financial contribution of a particular service line or program. And then the fourth, as I said, is developing ways to get this sort of information more routinely in the hands of the leaders of the organizations you're working with. One of the more tricky parts of this, for what it's worth, is the allocation methodology of figuring out in a nonprofit what makes sense to use as the denominator, oftentimes in splitting costs between different service lines. And we'll go into an example of that so you can have a little bit of a place to anchor yourself when you do this. Another tricky part of this is revenues and getting revenues appropriately classified. To the point that Katie made, sometimes revenues are clearly designated for a particular program. Sometimes revenues are more broadly sort of designated as general operating support. And we can talk about an analysis you can do there to understand where that general operating support is going. Both fundraising and the ED are typically what would be called overhead costs. And they're, in fact, if you're strict about the accounting parlance of nonprofits, they're the only 2 things that are considered to be overhead costs. Are fund development, fundraising, and the admin overhead of the ED and some of the other folks that would be considered over the entire organization. And a typical allocation methodology would be some measure of the size of the particular service line relative to the complete span that that person or those functions have. So you could use dollars of expense.
So you didn't try and identify how much time the ED spent on each function or things like that?
If there are particular programs that the ED is assigned to or believes that they spend significant time looking at, you would use a straight time allocation. And then when you get past that point where they say, I spend 10% on this and 25% on that, the rest can be allocated using something like expenses, could be used based on FTEs, the number of people that are in particular programs. The trickiest part to getting some of this done is getting people's time. The biggest cost you're going to find in any nonprofit you work with, not any, but most nonprofits, are the people. And people don't track their time in nonprofits. I have yet to find one where they do. It's somewhat antithetical to the culture of a nonprofit to ask them to take a timesheet out or to punch a clock. It just doesn't feel right for them. And so culturally, from doing this analysis, one of the things that we often run into is people just don't want to estimate how they spend their time. But you really can't get there from here unless people do. So some of the shortcuts you can use. We've asked people to go back over their calendars and just do it for a quarter or the last 4 weeks. If people have relatively routine jobs, we'll ask them to use their calendar and do it just as an estimate. Sometimes we'll work with an organization for a period of time and we'll say, let's do it for the first month of the engagement and see how that works. It oftentimes does result after the fact in organizations having timesheets and having codes for the different work that they do. Because to really understand how you're allocating your resources over time, you've got to get down underneath how the people are spending their time. Let's talk about this media arts nonprofit. This is an organization that has 3 main program areas. The first is they rent state-of-the-art computers and editing equipment to independent artists and producers to produce media, to help them express themselves, the experiences of their community through media. The second program area or service area is around education. They conduct classes in how to use some of this technology. And the third is workforce development, where they do job training for low-income individuals. So they've got these 3 broad service areas. They don't understand their costs. What you often hear on just a % of the total expense budget that should be in that area of the ED salary, the fundraising costs, is 8 to 10%. I've never seen a nonprofit we've worked with that's had true overhead cost of 8 to 10%. But nobody is willing to actually say what their overhead costs really are. Because the first one to sort of break the code of silence, if you will, in the nonprofit world about what it costs to run a nonprofit is going to be the one that everyone throws stones at. But in reality, it costs, as it does in corporations or well-run organizations, if you're doing this right, you're investing in people, you're investing in infrastructure. If you're growing, you're going to have a disproportionate amount of that in its overhead, et cetera. It's more than 8 to 10%. And that's actually one of our little bugaboos that we're trying to get changed in the sector is adequate investment in infrastructure. It shouldn't be looked upon as being poor management to be properly investing in infrastructure. There's clearly boundaries, and to your point, it does matter. But go ahead.
Well, I just like to second that because it's important that the agencies do it, but it's also important that the funders accept it because a lot of the grant-giving agencies, foundations, et cetera, say, oh, we'll fund the program, but no overhead.
Yeah, well, that's the classic. I mean, program-specific funding that includes zero overhead is not uncommon, as if somehow people were going to find funders who would just fund overhead, to pay for the rest. So you find a lot of organizations that a lot of the accounting is a bit of smoke and mirrors because they're put in this idiosyncratic funding market that doesn't allow them to fund appropriately. So there's a lot of, frankly, fibbing going on about what real costs are so that they can get things covered.
Also runs in the face of the push around capacity building and organizational effectiveness and building that. Because as you do that, your overhead and your administrative costs are going to go up.
Exactly.
And how do you tell the difference between someone who's investing versus someone who's just gotten inefficient?
Absolutely. And there's a certain hypocrisy that goes on in the funding community about the importance of capacity building, et cetera, but an unwillingness to actually provide general operating support or to provide reasonable indirect cost recovery in grant requests. What's interesting about doing an SLC analysis, one thing that I found in doing it, there's a level below, which is the better you can be at fully allocating costs, the better you can fundraise for a program's true costs, and the less overhead you're going to have to cover through other means. So if you can find a way to get marketing to not be overhead, but to understand how it's actually supporting the programs, it goes into the programs, and you can fundraise for it. So a lot of this is about appropriately getting as much cost as possible allocated so that you don't find yourself carrying this overhead, which is oftentimes a mishmash of things that just people don't have time to figure out how to allocate, that you can't ask anyone to pay for, and therefore you kind of have to pay for it yourself, either by fibbing or by hook or by crook. So their question to this organization was, what does each of our programs actually contribute, either positively or negatively? And how can we be financially sustainable? They were in this same boat of trying to figure out how do we long-term fund our organization, and they knew they didn't know enough to build a financial plan that was going to be sustainable. So what kind of data do you need to get to do this, and where do you go get it? Some of this is going to be basic for some of you, but I'm presuming a little bit of sort of starting from scratch will be appropriate. Organizational budgets, accounting reports. You'll get the direct and basic indirect costs. Program summary reports sometimes will have program-specific costs. Understanding how people spend their time. Job descriptions help. So spending a little time looking at the job descriptions of some of the more expensive staff members will help you figure out, at least at an 80-20 level, how you might allocate their time. Time allocation records, if they're kept or if you can create them. So asking folks to track their time or to do a backcasting of their time is a way to get at the biggest chunk of cost, which is staff time. In this case, they have a lot of rooms with a lot of expensive equipment that's being used for different programs. So in this case, one of the data sources was a room scheduling program, basically an online sort of calendar that tracked who used what rooms, which we went back and analyzed to figure out how the space in the facility was being allocated through these 3 different programs, because space was a really important and one of the bigger cost or line items on their costs. And they had a budget of about $3.4 million in total costs. You see the different areas in which they track their costs of the programs, support departments, occupancy, et cetera. And then what's shown here is the different allocation mechanisms, to your point. How might you consider allocating some of these costs to the different programs? So for depreciation, usage of equipment as a way to allocate out depreciation, or maybe in the area of rent, usage of space. We've gone around sometimes and taken blueprints and measured off the space and figured out which programs are consuming what portion of the space to allocate out the rent of the organization. These are the same basic allocation mechanisms you would use for cost accounting in a for-profit organization. Once again, the most important or biggest line item typically is labor costs. This just shows the labor cost of this organization split out across the 3 program areas. We've broken out workforce development here into 2, which is the youth training and the adult training. And internship. So they're broken out into 3. Sorry. So these 3 cumulatively are the workforce development. Basic blocking and tackling, right? I mean, this is not rocket science, but it's a level of clarity that a lot of nonprofits never get to. Here's just an example of how the occupancy and depreciation costs were allocated across these 5 areas based on usage. And this is where it got us. What this just shows is the full cost for the 3 basic service areas, the rental area, the workforce development area, and education. What's added on here is the revenue. So we did the next step of looking at the revenue side of their P&L, took the earned revenue, contributed revenue, et cetera, and understood where it was coming from and allocated against each of them. And as you'll see, that dashed line shows the rental program was actually net positive $148,000. The workforce development area was net negative $130,000, and education was virtually break even. The revenue side can be as tangled and spaghetti-like as the cost side in a nonprofit for just this reason. And if you're running a for-profit, generally you know if someone paid, paid for the room service bill, or they paid for the hotel, the room bill, or they paid for, a telephone charge. So you know where the money came from. That's not true in nonprofits. Oftentimes you have program-specific revenue, money that's been raised that's designated for a particular program. That goes right to the program, right? Sometimes you're earning revenue, like they are in the rentals here, where people are paying a copay and they're actually able to make some money in doing it. That goes directly to the program. General operating support is the fuzzy one, where monies have been contributed. Even individual donations would fall into this category. Undesignated funds that come in, they're actually the most important money a nonprofit has. If you do some of this analysis a few times over, you begin to really appreciate what's called discretionary revenue, which is the money that actually a nonprofit can invest at their discretion. It's money that nobody said where they had to put it. We don't allocate that money. What we typically do is we keep that aside. We just looked at the designated money in each of these categories, designated revenue, and we look at what the financial contribution is. What makes up the difference, I mean, this actually nets to 0 probably, close to 0. Is that right? So 140 and 140. Oftentimes what you see is if you net it across all 3 of those, you'd have a gross negative number, right? Well, the gross negative number gets paid for from somewhere, and it is, in essence, the investment of discretionary revenue against the programs. So if you show a nonprofit leader a chart that shows, of your 4 million or 3.5 million in this case, say you had $1 million that no one told you what to do with. And that $1 million found its way into these 3 programs, 600,000 in one, 200,000 in the other, and 200,000 in the other. That's the true decision in many cases that the ED gets to make, is what do I do with the 1 million that's on the margin? What's the 1 million that's in my pocket that I'm not told what to do with? And they go, oh my God, I actually spent 600 of that on that program? Because in their mind, what they're saying is, that wasn't worth $600,000 of the only $1 million I've got at my disposal to do something with. So what we do in this analysis is we don't take, to your point, the general undesignated monies and allocate them. We then, after the fact, look at the net negatives, and we show them where they spent their discretionary dollars to bring those programs, in essence, up to 0. Because that's how they paid for them.
For instance, when I was working in a consulting company and do these things, and typical reaction from the education program director is most of the undesignated money is actually from the parents of the community of the school. So if we terminate this program, that we are not going to have the many undesignated money. So we should consider this kind of money into the revenue. But what would you
So they
do?
claim it's theirs.
Sorry?
So they claim it's theirs.
Right,
so people
exactly.
say, well, it might be undesignated, but the reason those people gave it was for my program.
Yeah, so how would you respond to that kind of response? Would you compromise and take some portion of the money into the consideration to education, or you don't compromise because it's a principle?
I wouldn't compromise. I mean, I don't think compromise is the answer, because I don't think what this is trying to get at is some peace in the organization where everyone sort of agrees to agree about what it's costing. What you're trying to get at is whether the investment is a smart investment. So call it what you will. if you believe it's wise to take that $400,000 or whatever it is that the parents are donating and put it toward education, and that's the best and highest use of that money, go forth and have impact, right? But if you don't do the analysis, you'll never know. And if long-term they want to designate for everyone's sanity a certain amount of those discretionary dollars to go to a particular program based on its fundraising techniques and such, fine. Because these reports will then be a regular part of their discussion in the management team about whether we're making the right trade-offs with our money. And I also don't want you to leave you with the feeling that just because something's negative, you can it. This is a nonprofit. Nonprofit. Okay? It's not supposed to make money. But you better be sure that the impact you're getting for these programs is commensurate with how much money is being invested in them. And it is this on the margin differential of positive and negative that is what you're investing of the resources of the organization that are discretionary. Push this forward and we took one of the program areas and broke it out even further, the area of workforce development, because it was interesting that even within a program, if you did the allocation, you'd find that one part was much more negative than the others. Yeah. So where does this leave you? Say you do that analysis, you get to the point of understanding the net contribution for each of the programs. Last time we were together, May? It's a ways ago. I guess it was a couple quarters ago because we're doing these every 3 months. We talked about getting insight and clarity into the impact an organization is trying to accomplish, right? That was all our first session. What are the discussions? What are the questions? How might you map it out? How do you do a logic model to help a nonprofit leader be really clear about what they're trying to accomplish and how they get it? Well, if you have that analysis and you marry it with this analysis of what does it really cost to get it done, you can start looking at the portfolio of programs and understanding where you're subsidizing, where you're having great impact for the investment you're making, and where you might actually be doing something you shouldn't be doing. So what this shows on the y-axis is impact contribution. Obviously qualitative. It's not something you're going to end up with like international units of impact. But some sense, based on the theory of change and the intended impact of the organization, for what's more important, what's more contributing to impact, and what's less contributing to impact. In this case, the rentals of equipment that they were renting to artists who otherwise wouldn't have access, who otherwise couldn't create media about their experience from their community, was really high impact contribution. Some might say very mission aligned, if you will. Also in that analysis, we showed it was making a financial contribution that was positive for the organization. That's a good thing, right? Wouldn't draw these things. The upper right wouldn't be a good place to be. Let me do the other side, the education programs. Likewise, not as clearly aligned with their mission. They didn't feel it was having as much impact as their other programs, and it wasn't contributing. It was actually net negative. Begs the question: should we continue it? Should we find a way to improve it? What should we do with that program to bring it to a better place? So the right-hand side are these programs that are both contributing financially and on the impact. The lower left-hand side are programs that are both consuming resources and not as well aligned with your impact objectives. The upper left-hand corner are programs where you're making an investment. It's okay to have programs where you're making an investment in a nonprofit, but you better believe that you're getting impact when you're doing it. Likewise, in this lower right-hand corner, nonprofits have programs that are earning income for them, and they're doing that so they can pursue the other activities of their organization. And that can be okay. But you better believe you're getting enough income from it to justify the fact that you've taken that on, because it diverts management attention, it can confuse your brand, it can take people off point from getting their jobs done, and it can really generally sort of take you away from what is the mission-driven activity. So it better be a pretty positive net contribution if you're going to take it on. In this case, the youth training program was not as high impact as the others, but it was higher financial contribution. Technology-based nonprofit for this client, some of the things that came of doing the work, and you might see this if you try to use this technique with some of your clients. They got a lot better understanding of their economics. They understood which of their programs were contributing, which weren't. They developed a new language to talk about their work. They had never really had these words before to use as a management team. And they started writing grants that captured the full cost of their program. So there was less that they had to subsidize through their discretionary dollars. And they freed up those dollars to do other things, like innovate, create new programs, and do things that were more important to them. they started thinking about financial contribution as one of the ways they held themselves accountable internally. So this became a new measure of success for their programs. And they had some new systems that they put in place that came about from doing this analysis. And the one I mentioned before is just having a time tracking system sometimes ends up being one of the outcomes of doing the analysis. So what makes this hard to do? Getting the data can sometimes be really hard. We've had analysts, honestly, who are, Bain ACs, who are, accustomed to being really aggressive and being really creative, who will spend 2 months collecting the data in an organization to do this. So I would imagine in the context of your work, finding the shortcuts is going to be really important. Thinking about the way to do this 80-20, or maybe thinking about the way to use the client and their staff and training them to collect the data is going to be an important part of getting this done. This tracking time of people becomes important and difficult too when people think of themselves as playing multiple roles and finding themselves working across different job descriptions. The funding costs can be difficult to untangle, to the point before, what's really a designated fund and what's not. One thing you'll have to look out for is sometimes grants are made for periods that are quite different from when the money's received. So someone will get a 3-year grant, and you'll find that all of a sudden they got $2 million in 2003, but that $2 million is actually supposed to be partialed out over 3 years. So getting it clear, you would need to match the time as well as the program to get this right. And then the question is, where can you be focused? And if you do have questions you're trying to answer that are specific, do the 80-20 and just do the analysis in the areas where you need the data to answer the question that's at hand. This is the terminology that you'll see in nonprofits, at least the correct terminology as we understand it, sort of state of the art from the accounting world. 3 types of costs: direct costs, common costs, and overhead costs. And the direct costs include those expenses and that labor which you can just directly allocate and say, that person works for that program. We bought that paper to do that newsletter that went with that program. They're the direct costs. Common costs typically include things like rent, IT, phone. You said marketing. Marketing is oftentimes in there. And technically, overhead is what would be sort of, I don't even want to use admin because that'll just confuse things. Be the executive director, the CFO perhaps, and the chief development officer of the organization. CFO fall in there, Abby? Yeah?
Finance is always overhead.
Once again, you're pushing as much cost as you can down. In essence, you want as much to be below the overhead line as possible because you oftentimes can't raise money for overhead, but you can for the programs, and you're reasonably safe with a funder in allocating your direct costs and your common costs. So you want to get all the rent allocated to the programs, all the phone, all the IT, et cetera, because these costs are more recoverable than your overhead costs. We, with our clients, then go on and allocate overhead too, but some funders won't take that. They just won't. They won't buy it. They won't allow you to recoup your overhead. But they will say, well, yeah, you've got to have some space for the people to sit in. They got to have a computer. They got to have a phone. But oftentimes, all people fundraise for are the direct costs.
Forgetting the funding angle, which I think is really important, what do you view the value in distinguishing the common versus the overhead? Is it forgetting, for the clarity, the purpose of clarity?
Well, there's a little bit of, you can imagine the dynamic of a management team looking at their individual program budgets and their individual program actuals to budget and wanting to be clear about what's controllable and what's not. So there's a certain element of, at least internally as a group, this is individual control. This we can collectively control. This is, in some sense, out of our control, right? We can collectively, if we decide as a management team, take on less space. Or we can buy e-machines instead of Dell, or whatever the right thing would be. So these elements are a little bit more within the control of the management team. This is truly overhead in the sense of, we've only got these 3 folks. Either we get rid of one or we don't.
Where's HR and payroll, that kind of stuff?
Here. Payroll? Well, you're saying the people who are in the accounting group? Am I right? HR. Accounting's up here? Yeah. to the degree that an ED can say that 50% of their time they're doing program development, some of them do this, you might only have half of an ED that you call overhead. You might have an area of, call it new programs, or it might be the new program they're working on, and that takes the other portion of the ED's time. The objective is to push as much down as possible so you can fundraise for it, and so you actually do understand what's more controllable and less controllable within an organization. That would be my argument for why, beyond just fundraising, there's some logic to this schema. But that's just the terminology we've started using because we've seen it used most frequently in the sector. It's a little bit different than in a for-profit.